Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lisa Coley, and I serve as the Executive Director of Parapsychology Foundation. And on behalf of our Board of Trustees and our President, Mrs. Eileen Coley, I welcome you all here this evening. Now, the Eileen J. Garrett Research Library that you're seated within is known for its intimacy and its sense of community, and perhaps we have pushed the envelope a bit tonight thanks to the draw of our speaker tonight. But I'm certainly thinking of other options as we seek to expand, so please bear with us tonight. Now, before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I want to acknowledge that we have another prospective lecturer who spoke first, Dr. Arnold Latieri, whose excellent video. He's also at the Princeton Care Lab, and his video and speech was Minds, Machines, and Anomalies. So you'll forgive me this crass commercialism, but it's an excellent lecture. So now let me tell you about Dr. Roger Nelson. He is the director of the Global Consciousness Project, working in Princeton University's Pear Lab. From 1980 to 2002, he developed ways to study consciousness fields in real-world situations. He's interested in group consciousness effects and the idea that mind plays a subtle but important constructive role in the physical world. He established the GCP in 1998 with the goal of capturing indications that we are becoming a noosphere, a layer of intelligence for the Earth. 4 years of accumulated data show a persistent pattern. When we are collectively engaged by powerful events, the GCP's network of detectors responds with a tiny correlation. PF is proud to host one of those detectors here on site, and I'm very pleased at this point to introduce you to Dr. Roger Nelson as he speaks to Patterns Where There Should Be None, a Glimpse of Global Consciousness.
Thank you, Lizette. That's a very kind introduction, and I'm really happy to be here. This is pretty well packed, and we will have to bear with each other. What I'd like to do is talk pretty fast, show you a lot of pictures, explain how things work for roughly an hour or so, and then take time to just talk about, if we can figure that out, what it might mean, what it is that we're actually looking at. As Lizette said, this is a project that's been ongoing for now 4.5 years roughly. And I guess the best thing for me to do is move toward immediately to telling you how things work, what the project is made of, and then I'll show you pictures of the kind of results that we see. This is an international thing. The map that you saw just before showed little dots all over the world. We have about 50 sites, where actually 55 or so, where friends who are sometimes scientists, sometimes artists, sometimes regular folks, host what we call an egg. I'll explain a little bit more what that is shortly. We're basically taking technology that's been used in the laboratories for a long time to find out whether, if people try to work their will in the physical world, whether they might be successful in changing the way the physical world is very slightly. That technology, which we refer to as REGs, random event generators, random number generators, has gradually become more compact so we can take it out in the field. We started doing that at one point. Ultimately, this project is about using that same technology, but looking on a really grand scale, looking at the whole Earth, maybe at an Earth mind, maybe at a global consciousness, maybe it's something else. We really don't know quite what it is yet, but we're thinking about it. This is one of my favorite sort of ways of putting things. If you have your idea, you get clear, give it a name, and you're all in accord, it becomes. Maybe that will even be true for peace in the world if we work at it. Technology that we use has really only been available for a very few years. We're dependent on high-speed computers and communication networks. The internet, as everybody knows, even though it seems pretty natural now, it hasn't been around very long. It really only grew into a strong, solid condition about a decade ago, even less. So we have rather sophisticated designs for these instruments that run continuously on computers that are synchronized, so they all read exactly the same time. And we gather the data in Princeton and then do a lot of processing to find out whether the data have anything to tell us. Just to start with some background, here's what the devices look like. They're pretty small, easily fit in your pocket or your palm. And on the other hand, they're extremely well designed and extremely, it's too soft?
Thank you.
Okay, I'll shout. These devices have been used in laboratory experiments for a long time for something, just project, right? For the intentional experiments. What they do is produce random numbers that are very much like flipping coins. And what we do in this project and in a lot of the experiments is to flip a lot of coins every second, 200 coins, and count how many heads there are, basically. You wind up, of course, with something like 100. And the idea in the experiments in the laboratory is to try to get a little bit more than 100 or a little bit less than 100, according to your intention. That isn't exactly what we do in this project, but it's close. We're looking for differences from what a random number is supposed to do. This is a picture of what they are supposed to do and what they do when nobody's paying intention or attention and nothing big is happening. They make a distribution in these red bars which fits the theoretical curve so closely that you can't really tell the difference. And what we're looking for ultimately is a way to tell the difference. I'm showing you a lot of this background stuff so you'll be able to understand the pictures that I will show you later of the data from the Global Consciousness Project itself. If you take all those trials every second, say, and ask how close, how different is it from what's expected, you get deviations. If you add those up over time, you can imagine that sometimes the deviation is high, sometimes it's low. If you add up a sequence like that, you get a wandering, random walk. Sometimes people call it a drunkard's walk. There's a step taken, but you don't know which direction. And a drunk doesn't care. The random number generator doesn't care either. But we do. And in the laboratory, we do experiments where people try to get high numbers. They try to get more heads or more tails. And this is a picture of data taken in one experiment we call the REG experiment at the Pear Lab. This is a number of years, 6 or 7 years worth of data. And what you can see is the trays called high and the trays called low do not wander down the middle. They don't look random anymore. And the only reason we can discover for that is the fact that the people are trying to produce something a little different from what's expected from these random number generators. The trace in the middle here is more what you'd expect if the thing is truly random. So this is a tiny, tiny effect. It's buried deep in the noise, and it takes a lot of processing to get it out, but it's extraordinary. This means, essentially, we believe that your mind is not stuck in your head. It extends out into the world. It actually is creative. It can do something in the world, even though it may not be a profoundly important thing to change the way the numbers come out of a random event generator. That's not so important as the fact that something happens in the world that is really a new thing, a created thing, because of your intelligence in your mind. We, about in the early 90s, started thinking, well, let's see if we can't, now that there's such, laptop computers and smaller and smaller versions of the REGs. By the way, the data that I just showed you came from a machine that's like this on a table instead of something you can hold in your hand. But we now have these tiny ones that you can take them out into the field. So we started doing what we called field REG experiments. And now we're not asking about intentions. We're just saying, what happens if we go into a situation where people are really focused, really enjoying some particular thing that takes them out of their own individuality and maybe melds them into a group. what happens then to these random number generators? I'll just show you one example. Over here is a random walk. I was traveling with a group of 19 people in Egypt, and those people were all interested in the ancient religions. If anybody, you can remember that, right? Although we could figure out a way to go, we can go backwards. Here we went into the Queen's Chamber in the Great Pyramid, and we had agreed ahead of time. We were planning to do chanting and meditation and that sort of thing, and we were made to feel very focused. I mean, the place is pretty striking and amazing. And then we went into the Grand Gallery, and this trend, which began here, just continued. This is so improbable as to be like 1 in a million chances that could be just a chance kind of thing. And this extraordinary trends continued. So we're looking at something different from what should happen. Again, it's just not random. If we do take a set of data like I just showed you and make one point out of it, and then do that again and again, we gradually build up a data set that becomes very persuasive that something is happening that's not random. Is this all pretty straightforward? I guess, right? So the next step is to start thinking in, a little bigger. And there were a couple of other things that one or another of us did first, but when Princess Diana was killed, probably everybody here knows that there was, even if you weren't a Diana watcher, you kind of became involved a little bit. I did, anyway. That funeral gathered millions and who knows, maybe 1 billion people or something like that. So thinking about Diana and having feelings of compassion and so forth. So we organized a dozen or so people to take data, and this red trace is what happened during Diana's funeral. These here are what happens when you just do random chance kind of things. Pretty big difference again. So this was next thing to saying, let's go ahead and make a kind of a permanent installation like this. Let's see what happens if we take data in other occasions where something might, something you might call global consciousness is, coming into being. There are lots of things that cause us to focus and cause us to think communally. I won't read them all, but you can. Natural disasters, the beginnings of war, all kinds of things stand out as what we can call a global event, defined as something that's going to bring us all together. So we made a network of what have come to be called eggs. My son actually gave the network that name because he said, what we're doing is a little bit like an electroencephalogram where you put electrodes on somebody's head, only we're putting REGs on the earth body, right? And connecting them by the internet. In any case, we call these individual devices the combination of software and this little gadget and the connections, this sort of a fairly sophisticated thing, even though it's simple in concept. So each of these blocks represents one of those eggs. This is a picture of a real-time display, which if you go to the website, you can watch these things blinking every second. They change. You get a big bar like this. That means a great big deviation happened someplace. Another picture of the map. This is the locations. We have them in every continent and almost everywhere. Well, enough anyway to get a pretty good picture of, a kind of broad spectrum look at the Earth. This is what the data look like. Pretty messy, right? This is noise, as far as we can tell. There's no pattern that you can see there. But if we start doing a little statistical processing, we can begin to make a little sense of it. This is the same data, only now spread out with each egg doing this cumulative deviation I was talking about before. Most of them are kind of in the middle, but once in a while you get one with a long, steady trend. If you get a bunch of them doing that at the same time, you put, combine them all, compress all of that data into one data line, maybe you get a very strong trend like this. This is now, we're getting to the point of looking at the kind of data that the kind of analysis we usually do for our global events. This is an earthquake it happened at this time. We're looking at a little before and a little bit after. Maybe something, maybe the Earth mind or global consciousness has premonitions. Later we'll see some suggestion that that may indeed be the case. So this is a kind of picture, and what we're looking for is a tendency to go away from this horizontal line. Remember the random walk? That's horizontal. This isn't very different from horizontal ultimately, but it has a couple of big parts in it and winds up fairly far outside the expectation zone. Here's one that's a little more persuasive. Earth Day in 2001. Very strong trend. It's actually significant statistically, again, compared with ordinary random walk. So this, okay, this is a kind of picture. This is a word in the language, maybe, of Global Consciousness Project. So I'll show you some more examples. It may be that these are meaningful. We can't be sure. There's always a chance that that we're looking at just something that's an accident. But when we start asking questions like, what about these horrible events in Israel, a suicide bombing? You may remember the Passover bombing. I think there were 25 or 20 some people killed in they were celebrating, and somebody, came in and destroyed them. Shortly thereafter, there was an incursion by the Israeli army. It's not. I want to make sure that we all understand this isn't really necessarily what it looks like, but it's suspicious. It's a little bit like, let's pay attention. Maybe the global consciousness is seeing something or telling us something. Maybe not. We look at a variety of different kinds of things. A lot of people say, well, the Super Bowl, that's got to do it, don't you think? Or World Cup soccer. Soccer is, after all, the most popular sport, team sport in the world, probably. But it turns out that sports events don't make an impression. We don't know necessarily why, but if you think about it, there may be a lot of coherence, but there's certainly a couple of different actors in a sporting contest, and maybe there's something else going on. This one was a pretty striking event. The Pope went to the Middle East and spent 6 days, and I think it may be fair to say that a lot of people saw that as a hopeful sign. This is a couple of years ago now. And unfortunately, in the meantime, that the hopes that lots of people had, and presumably the Pope was working toward, have not really matured. But at that time, we had such a strong trend over this is 6 days, and I said, this is, I could hardly believe it. Must be something wrong. So I took a special set of control data, and you can see what that looks like. It's as flat as a pancake, so to speak. That looks like the random walk that we expect from random number generators. Political events, maybe for some reason that's similar to what happens in sporting events, don't necessarily make it big in the eyes of the global consciousness network. This is probably a lot of people everywhere, not just in the United States, were pretty interested in the final resolution of that Clinton impeachment business. Certainly there are a lot of people interested in the elections in 2000. Some people are still interested and still a little dismayed or curious. One of the kinds of things we can do is look at the U.S. eggs only. This was, after all, a U.S.-centric kind of event. Turns out that the green trace, which represents only the eggs in the U.S., doesn't look much different from the rest of the world. A friend who does, his day job is technical analysis for big companies doing stock market trading, trying to figure out how to spend billions of dollars, I guess you might say. They have enormously complicated programs that take dozens or maybe hundreds of factors and put that all together and try to come up with some indication of which is the best way to go. He said that at one point he got interested in astrology and decided, well, why not try it? Add that into my equations. And it turned out that, according to his track record, that was actually a good thing to do. It wasn't the only thing that was working for him, but it helped a little bit. So he said, you ought to try that too. And I asked him to give me some dates, and sure enough, this is one out of two examples, both of which, to my amazement, I think also his, showed a pretty strong trend in part of the runs. This combined data set is actually so-called significant. The probability is about 1 in 100 that there should be that much deviation. So, we have a lot to learn about what might make a difference to the global consciousness. One thing that is unfortunately the case, if you think about, as I do, as I must, in order to pick events in the world, a lot of them are tragic. A tremendous number of them are tearing up the social fabric, in a phrase. Our very first event was in 1998, the bombings in Nairobi, the embassy bombings, which seemed to me to be such a travesty that the global consciousness, if there is such a thing, should pay attention, should notice that. And you can see this line is a very powerful indication that was correct. This is pseudo-random data, which is done as a kind of control. You can see a big difference there. So even though you can't tell anything from a single trial or a single experiment in this kind of work, it was an auspicious beginning, we thought. And speaking of beginnings, in Kosovo or in Yugoslavia, there was an exact moment in time when the bombing started. And we had made a formal prediction, which is just a little short time in here, but this is the context. This is a classic random walk on the left side of the graph. Here, at exactly the moment the bombing began, we see a really big jump in the data line. And this curve, even though it doesn't go off this direction or any, they're so different that it looks to me, and looks probably to you as well, as if something changed. It looks as if a signal was given or a word was said, and so an understanding occurred. I shouldn't go on too much in that kind of language, but there are befores and afters, and we can see the difference sometimes in the global consciousness data. Here's a picture of, many of you may have been aware of the giant Buddhas. They're 50 meters high. How do I get rid of that? There were two of these huge things, I think 50 meters, that's really big. And they're also really old. They're a treasure, which now doesn't exist anymore. The Taliban brought in cannons, and that wasn't sufficient. They finally brought in people whose business is knocking buildings down, and they blew up the whole, they just drilled the holes, filled it with dynamite, and blew away these treasures. And we don't know exactly the time that happened, but it was sometime around in here. This is what the global consciousness data did that day. Striking. And maybe it was a response to another kind of travesty. And then there was the World Trade Center. Unquestionably, by any reasonable standard, a global event. We, of course, looked at the data on this day in great detail and essentially asked what the data had to say. This is a week's worth of data, several days leading up. What does that look like? A random walk, right? Around the time, actually what looks like a little bit before the time of the bombing, the first hit is right in the middle of that square. You can see without explanation that there's a big change. There's another before and after. This strong trend, highly significant trend, lasted for 2 days, a little bit more than 2 days. At this point it became level again, which is what it should do if it's random. But we looked at the data a lot of different ways, as you can probably easily understand. Here's a completely different perspective. And what we've been looking at is what we think of as a kind of mean shift. That distribution that I was showing you early on, that can be shifted one way or the other. That's what we look at most of the time. This is a width of the distribution. This is what's called variance. So this is the beginning of the day at about 5 o'clock in the morning, which is, as you know, the attacks were actually at 8:45, the first. At about 5, the variance got a little bit larger than it should be, and it continued to be that way until about 11 o'clock. And at 11, it reversed direction, became small, and dropped, and continued to be small for about another 6 or 8 hours until dinner time, and then oscillated some more after that. This is highly improbable. It's the sort of thing that if you do, just random data, you get lines that look like this. This is improbable, so improbable that there is no day in our database that even begins to look like it, even though we have other sort of big events. This is another perspective on the same data. This is what's called autocorrelation. One of the defining qualities of random sequences or random numbers is that they are independent. They shouldn't be related to each other at all from one step to the next. This is a picture of relationship over long spans of time, up to about 2 hours. In other words, instead of being independent, these data became sort of lockstep. They became locked into a pattern, you might say, such that this red trace, which is the real data on September 11th, is a completely different animal from what you see in ordinary days surrounding September 11th, treated exactly the same way. All of these curves are generated with exactly the same, computer algorithms, and I think this is about as striking a piece of evidence that there's something different about the data on that day. What it actually means, we have to learn still. Well, we have also events in the world which are aimed in the opposite direction, aimed to try to recover a little bit, to move back away from the destructive toward the constructive. And we are capable of constructive activity. I'll show you a few examples. Some of you may have participated in some of these. In Chicago, well, actually in many of the big cities, in Washington, in several of the capitals of Europe, at a certain time on September 14th, there was a moment of silence, actually 3 minutes long. This is just a crowd in Chicago. This is the trace during the 3-minute period of time. It doesn't look like the ones we've been looking at necessarily before, but it also doesn't look random. So how to interpret it remains to be seen. But at least there's a suggestion here that, again, when very large numbers of people are focused on something, well, in this case, on peace and a kind of memorial service, a kind of ceremony of remembrance, you get something that looks a little different from random. Many of you are aware of the Transcendental Meditation efforts now and then to gather large numbers of people together to meditate without necessarily thinking about peace or nonviolence or anything like that. They just meditate, and they say, if we have enough people doing that, there will be a consciousness field that will spread out and make everything calm, reduce crime and so forth. Stimulated by the September 11th events, they gathered late in September for several days, 5 days, and got as many of their advanced meditators as possible together to meditate. This is a picture of the whole 5 days. It doesn't really look random. It doesn't have a single trend, but on the day they had the most people, which is the 26th, this is what the data look like. Again, a fairly strong indication is not, these are data taken all over the world, not in Fairfield, Iowa, but in the Global Consciousness Network. In Japan, there are people who, well, I guess they're maybe Buddhists, they believe in healing. They're called Jorei. They have places all around the world, including in New York. And on the 1st of April in 2001, they had a kind of induction or introduction ceremony for people just joining the group or just becoming, I don't know, advanced, or I don't know exactly the purposes, but they had synchronized ceremonies, and we decided to take a look at that. And again, you have a fairly strong trend for people doing something like you might think of as healing. Here's the Kumbh Mela celebrations in India, where millions, allegedly, I think it really is millions of people come, and they all want to bathe in the Ganges. And this is the daylight hours of the focused day in January of 2001. Again, a fairly persuasive trend. This is one I like very much. Just by coincidence, the shape of the trend is exactly the shape of my confidence envelope. The vote on the Kyoto Protocol, which, alas, the United States failed to join in, but most other people in the countries in the world decided that was a good idea. And this is just a picture of what I think of as getting our ecological act together, or at least working toward that. Natural disasters, somewhat surprisingly, don't necessarily produce big trends. It may be that we haven't done enough examination yet. This one, by the way, is an exception. This is a Turkish earthquake in 1999, which killed so many thousands of people. I think estimates from 20 to 30,000 people died in this earthquake. So this is a picture of the data for a half hour. The earthquake is right here. So we see this trend beginning somewhat before the earthquake itself, the first major tremors. A friend in Europe, Dick Bierman, did some other kinds of analyses. There's a couple of different ones. He looked at the variance that I mentioned before, the one where the distribution is spreading. This is a picture of what the variance did. Here's the earthquake, wanders way up for about 2 hours, and is persuasive like that is also that something unusual is happening. He also took advantage of this particular occasion to ask, where is the signal biggest? Must be close to Turkey, right? Turns out the biggest signal is in the U.S. Concatenation of about 12 of these devices in the U.S. had a bigger signal than the ones in Europe. Now, it's not conclusive, but it's a question that we're beginning to work on a little bit. This is more typical of our natural disaster kinds of things. This is not a trend that you would say is showing necessarily a strong indication. This one is perhaps even more unpersuasive, fairly flat, no strong trends in either direction. This was a terrible, huge, tragic event. Went on for days and days. Maybe we just picked the wrong time to look, but this is a typhoon where people lost their homes, lost their lives in very large numbers in India. Here's we've looked at several of the sort of major accidents, the ones that make the news very exciting for a little while. This is the Concorde in France. This is a 4-hour period. For 2 hours, we had a really strong trend in one direction, then it reversed and went the other direction. The Kursk submarine, I happened to be in Europe at the time, and I know there, and probably it was true here, people were empathetic or deeply concerned and wondering, could there be any chance of rescuing the people on the crew from the submarine? This is a big train crash in India. Here I'm showing you all the eggs for a 4-hour period, which for the first 2 hours, the crash is right here. For the first 2 hours, there's nothing apparently interesting, and then there's a strong trend. We don't know for sure if that's meaningful, but decided in this case, let's look at the eggs that are closest and look only at the first hour and a half. In other words, in that period, the closest eggs were showing a rather strong reaction. So again, a little bit of an indication that maybe there's something there which we don't know how to look for until we look a little deeper. Yeah. The lighter side. I should look at good. What better example than New Year's? this is, I'll show you a little more detail, but we think of New Year's as a kind of global celebration, and indeed it is, even though there are other New Years, like Chinese New Year's, which is, what, 2 days ago, something like that. This is Hong Kong, that's New Zealand, I don't remember where that is, New York, of course, London, this is Malaysia. So, I mean, people do celebrate New Year's all over the place. Looking at some detail, it's an obvious thing to look at because, you know, at least in large portions of maybe most of the world, people look at New Year's as a time to just relax out and focus on counting down to 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, and drink champagne or kiss somebody. And so what we decided to do was look at the 10-minute period just surrounding New Year's. And the first one we looked at was extraordinarily promising. The next one we looked at, well, it's positive but hardly persuasive by comparison to the very first one. This is also the Y2K New Year, which, as you all recall, was so exciting in a certain sense. Everybody was worried that the whole computer network system and all banks and businesses would crash. Nothing happened, except we had a good time celebrating. There were bigger parties than usual that year. My friend Richard Broughton decided to take the idea of the, you know, this metaphor of EEG and EGG, electrodiagram, to take this kind of seriously and use the same kind of analysis and technology to look at the global consciousness data as is used in brain physiology. You flash a light in somebody's eyes and you take measurements of the brain physiology and do some processing, and you can see what's called evoked potential. So he said midnight is a stimulus. We'll look for an evoked potential around midnight. He said, well, it won't do really to look where there is no celebration. Places like the middle of the ocean, there's nobody doing celebrations. So he took all the time zones that have big celebrations and called that maxi celebrating. And this is the trace. By the way, you can see individual traces here. They're a little bit high. When you add these all up, But what we use is electronic stuff. Mickey?
This whole idea of the experimenter effect is so fascinating with this thing, but would it be so hard to really check it out? I mean, for example, what if something like, I mean, you have a very sort of Gaia-like consciousness yourself, and probably the people that are working with you more or less have that bent, philosophical bent perhaps. But what if we had somebody like, let's just say, for example, Richard Wiseman, who organized a whole series of eggs of his own all around the world, with people who are really into sports, or you know, try and stack it in a certain way. That would be interesting to look at. I mean, that would maybe answer the question.
Well, one of the things that we decided very early on was that this is an entirely public project. All the software is publicly available. All of the data are publicly available. So if you can talk Richard into setting up his own network, hey, he can use the software. But more seriously, in answer to your question, I think that's more or less, I mean, that's a sensible way to go. I think there are a number of different kinds of things we could do like that. We could be taking data from eggs that nobody knows about, except the person who set them up. You know, like if you wanted to, or Richard wanted to, there could be a whole other network that I don't even know about. And if it shows something very different from this, then we would have some suggestion that it is a kind of experimenter effect. Although, I
was thinking more along the lines of sort of sheep and goats, trying to separate the two.
Yeah, Richard Wiseman is a skeptic who actually does research. It's a nice thing, and a little rare. He also collaborates with parapsychologists, side proponents, and he and Marilyn Schlitz did a really wonderful kind of experiment where they each performed the experimenter role using the same subject population. And Marilyn, who's a very friendly and psi-conducive kind of experimenter, got her usual significant results, and Richard got flat results. Perfect, answer to the question about experimenter effects. Unfortunately, it's not the whole answer yet by any means, but it's a very good indication that the attitude, the engagement of the experimenter is part of the picture. We should not lose sight of that in this subtle business of trying to figure out what consciousness is like. Did you have a question?
I had a question or a thought, but I don't know if it's relevant now. Wasn't it coined 90, 100 years ago, Jung or Adler, the collective unconscious, and that we all bombarded with the same stimuli will all respond very similarly? Is that relevant to what we're talking about?
I think it is,
I think it is.
Well, yeah. Jung is not exactly a founding, guiding light necessarily, but he's certainly somebody who talked usefully about what you might think of as the breadth of consciousness. You know, the idea that we can stick an electrode on and get it is, I think, too limiting. And we have to do things like think deeply and think creatively and paint pictures and write poetry and do the kinds of analysis and assessments that Jung did. The guiding light, by the way, and then this is the website where you can look for more details if you want to. This name, Noosphere, that's coined by a Russian, but most people think it was coined by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And he wrote beautifully and poetically. He was a scientist and a theologian, but he wrote about the future of man and the phenomenon of man. And he said, why are we here? He thought that we are here, in fact, to produce this shell of intelligence for the earth. And Jung, I think, would have agreed with him. Yes.
How do you interpret the lull, sort of non-result from natural disasters? I mean, for instance, could there be like a world fear factor? Like if a war event happens, it wouldn't produce something?
Yeah.
Are you thinking along those lines, or?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I guess the closest I come to...
become astronauts, so maybe we don't care.
Well, I think caring is a great part of it. Something like empathy and compassion seem to be very, very much involved in all of the, what you might call big hits. All of the highly, somebody just recently sent me a kind of small, almost informal analysis, but that was the point of it. What do we find that's common to all the ones that produce these really big, strong hits? And it's empathy and compassion. So the natural disasters can produce that, but a lot of times we don't even know about them, except if we're in the neighborhood. Sometimes when they're really big, they make BBC at least, but not necessarily Fox 5.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about the role of the media, that sometimes the delayed effect of a tragedy would be because it happened while people were asleep.
Yeah.
And it's not until they turn on their TVs and hear about it that you get the reaction.
Yeah.
And the natural disasters in another part of the globe just are not given media coverage, so they don't generate the global
Right.
empathy.
It's, I basically agree, but I'm kind of holding back a little bit on drawing any kind of conclusions because I think it's entirely possible that this is the strongest sort of speculative statement I think I'll make. I think it's entirely possible there is a global consciousness, which is its own consciousness. Doesn't have to wait until CNN says so. It already knows. And I think it's entirely possible that that global consciousness is like ours at its best, or at its most free, where it's capable of manifesting, it's capable of precognizing, it's capable of a lot of things that that we can hope to learn about.
Can you figure that?
I'm sorry. First, all right.
Oh, I just said, can you figure that out to measure like when the event happens and when the news of the event happens? Isn't there?
Yeah, we've looked at that, and what the results are thoroughly ambiguous. Sometimes it looks like we don't see anything until the news spreads.
Right.
And that you may remember I mentioned an Indian earthquake. Yeah. We didn't see anything moving in the data until 2 hours after the major tremor. And maybe that's about the right time for it to spread around the world. On the other hand, in 9/11 we saw big changes, unmistakable changes, looking at it in retrospect, at 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning. So that's 4 hours before anything happened. So we've got a big range there, and work to do in order to understand that. Very interesting stuff, though. Yeah.
I hope it doesn't happen, but it probably will. The future bombing of Iraq is going to trigger such polarized emotions around the world. I mean, I hope most of the world will find it pretty terrible. A portion of the world are going to think that's great news. So you've got a combination of the celebratory factor mixed in with the kind of shock and horror factor.
Yeah.
Is that going to be a mutually reinforcing trend, or will they cancel each other out in some way? Or is that
It's a really good question, and I don't know the answer. We do have a formal prediction already registered, along with a note that we hope we never get a chance to find out, never get a chance to test it. But certainly at least we were shown indications that the reaction to the 9/11 terrorist attacks was not uniformly distributed all over the world. There were some people that were dancing in the streets, apparently, although it may have been exaggerated in the news. I'm sorry I skipped over you.
My question is, as far as a global consciousness is concerned, whether or not it's separate from humanity, which I can't imagine that it would be a Gaia consciousness, is that comprised, in your opinion, of only human thought or all sentient thought?
I love the question. I don't know the answer. I'll just tell you what I think. Let's go for it. Yeah. Let's kind of, have the whole thing running. That's what I think must happen.
Right, because human thought is a very small portion of consciousness.
Absolutely. And if you look, and you probably do look at the sages, that's what they say. They have always said, we at our best, have always understood that there is just one world, one universe, and we're a manifestation of that. We're not standing all by ourselves. We're connected, and we're connected to the plants and the rocks and the trees and the water.
Would you have any interest or any, perhaps in the future along the lines of your studies, some way of maybe, hopefully not lab rats, but some way of gauging that consciousness that's non-human form?
That's a real. I think it's a great idea, but.
Because animals always know when an earthquake is going to happen or fire's happening.
So
or
it's
things like
said,
that.
yeah.
Supposedly, sorry.
Well, so far, I mean, this is the best I know how to do at this point. But we do have, I mean, we should be thinking about how to tap into the consciousness of a plant. And some people have done that. You know? Some of you may be aware of the healing research that shows that you can change the way some of the very, the fine particles in your immune system are doing their things by prayer.
Well, with quantum mechanics, us being the observer, we're part of the observed. So the idea being that if you can direct your mind towards, say, personal healing, get rid of cancer, whatever, that if logically, A, first you believe enough in it, and B, you focus enough on it, you should inevitably get C, which is a result of a reduction of the cancer.
Yeah, I think so. And in fact, I'd be prepared to, I'm not exactly a betting man, but I bet a full quarter sometimes. I'd put my quarter on that. And the form is very broad. I think that, what we're looking at here, I mentioned there's a lot of noise. We're pulling a signal out of noise. We're straining, really, to find this tiny little needle in a haystack. That's happening all the time. I think there's every reason to believe that that you should have a positive attitude, that you should pray for your friends if they're ill, because it's not going to hurt, and it may do a little good. It probably is doing a little good, even if it isn't enough necessarily to bring them out of the disaster zone.
Just to go a little bit further with what you were saying, you started your talk by saying maybe being aware of consciousness and things, we could even achieve something like world peace. Could you expand a little bit more? I know it's theoretical, but I still was intrigued by that.
Yeah, well, we've been praying all of our existence. We've been casting runes and formulating magic spells and so forth. And we wouldn't continue to do that if it wasn't efficacious at some level. I mean, you stop doing things that don't work. So at some level we know, deep in our bones, that it's a good idea to think positively and to pray and to extend your will out into the world, to make this consciousness field, if you will, manifest something like peace in the world. You know, if you're around somebody who's smiling, what do? You smile. You know, if you're around somebody who's, probably most of you have sometime gone, to meet some guru someplace, and you find that you have a different feeling about things in the presence of somebody who's calm. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think yes, we ought to do the best we can to manifest peace. Yeah, and there's a better chance that it will happen if we do that. Yeah.
Have you ever looked into shielding? What happens if you bury one of these devices miles down or far away in Antarctica?
Okay.
Under lead bricks?
Yeah. So far as we can tell, shielding doesn't work. Physical shielding, like you're talking about, doesn't impede the whatever it is that affects these devices at all. The most extreme version of that is some experiments with submarines. Ingo, were you involved in those? They were deep in the ocean, about as good shielding as you can imagine, and the signal went straight through. So.
But there were still people there.
There were people on the sub, and there were people on land. Well, I don't know of any such extreme experiment, but the devices themselves are, they're built to be shielded in the first place. Because we don't want electromagnetic things to bother them. So already we're trying to shield away common influences that we're not interested in, but our, if you will, psychic signals do penetrate. Nobody's done anything as extreme that I am aware of as you were talking about, but my guess is that that physical shielding just doesn't impede the signal.
Because it would differentiate between Gaia consciousness and these things being influenced by human consciousness.
Maybe it would, but if you think about this network, what?
If you saw a difference, if you saw that
Yeah.
one far away from people didn't react where other ones
Yeah.
did.
So the real answer is we don't know. So far, it's a good question. Yes, is it?
I think I'll ask the final question. Since the foundation has an egg here, will it sense our gratitude and thank you for your lecture because it was really a
We'll have to check. Thank you all very much.
Hi there. I hope you enjoyed today's selection. My name is Lisette Coley and I serve as president of Parapsychology Foundation. I hope you give us a like, and if you have a comment, then do so below and we'll try and better serve you. Any suggestions are welcome. And we want to thank very much our loyal subscribers. This is a relatively new channel and a new venture for Parapsychology Foundation, so we very much appreciate your loyalty. And if you haven't decided to subscribe, maybe pretty please you could.